Sue me. Marcus laughed, pointing at the massive infinity pool that stretched 12 feet onto my property. You think some piece of paper is going to make me tear down $70,000 of paradise? He was standing in his designer swim trunks, drink in hand, while his contractors finished the final touches on what should have been the crown jewel of his backyard renovation. My name is Nathan Pierce, I'm 47 years old, and I'm a civil engineer for the Department of Public Works in Riverside County, California. I've spent the last 23 years of my career ensuring that construction projects follow proper codes, permits, and property boundaries. So when I came home from a 2-week business trip to Phoenix and found an Olympic-sized pool occupying a significant portion of my carefully maintained back garden, I knew exactly what I was looking at. A man who thought money could buy him immunity from consequences. I stood there at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, surveying the damage to my property line with the same methodical precision I'd used to inspect thousands of construction sites. The pool deck alone covered 847 square feet of my land. The water feature, complete with imported Italian tile and underwater LED lighting, had destroyed my prize-winning rose garden that had taken 8 years to cultivate. But Marcus was still talking, oblivious to the fact that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his entitled life. "Look, Nathan," he said, using the tone people reserve for explaining things to children, "this is a $40,000 a month neighborhood. Your little garden was bringing down everyone's property values anyway. You should be thanking me for the upgrade." I nodded once, said, "I understand your position," and walked back to my house without another word. Marcus called after me. Something about being reasonable and working things out like neighbors, but I was already mentally cataloging the violations I'd observed. Unpermitted construction on adjacent property, no setback compliance, likely utilities infractions, possible environmental violations if they'd removed the old oak tree without city approval, which from the fresh stump near the pool's edge they clearly had. What Marcus didn't know was that my quiet demeanor wasn't submission. It was the calm that comes from knowing exactly how much trouble someone has just created for themselves. The foundation of a problem. Marcus Hartwell moved in next door 3 years ago, shortly after divorcing his second wife and cashing out his pharmaceutical consulting business for what neighborhood gossip suggested was somewhere north of $8 million. The house, a sprawling 6,200 square foot modern monstrosity, had been the largest renovation project our quiet cul-de-sac had ever seen, where the previous owners, the elderly Kowalski couple, had maintained a modest ranch home with beautiful gardens. Marcus had built what looked like a luxury resort dropped into the middle of suburbia. I'd tried to be neighborly initially, when his construction crews started at 6 a.m. every morning for 6 months straight. I mentioned the city noise ordinance that prohibited construction before 7 a.m. Marcus shrugged and said his contractors worked on their own schedule. When his landscaping project diverted water runoff onto my property, flooding my basement twice, I brought it to his attention with photos and suggested he contact his drainage contractor. He told me to take it up with my insurance company. The warning signs were all there. Marcus operated under the assumption that rules were suggestions for people with less money than him. But I'm not the type to escalate conflicts unnecessarily. My wife Patricia used to say I had the patience of a saint and the memory of an elephant, qualities that served me well in engineering but sometimes frustrated her when she wanted me to push back more forcefully against people who took advantage. Patricia passed away 4 years ago from ovarian cancer. The rose garden Marcus had just destroyed was planted in her memory, each variety chosen to bloom in sequence so that something would always be flowering from March through October. The old oak tree they'd cut down was where we'd scattered some of her ashes, with the city's permission and proper documentation naturally. Marcus knew this. I'd told him the story 2 summers ago when he complained that the tree's canopy was blocking afternoon sun to his deck. I'd offered to trim the branches that overhung his property line, at my expense, following proper arborist protocols. He'd said he'd think about it. Now I knew what he'd been thinking. Discovery and documentation. The morning after my return from Phoenix, I walked the property line with my surveyor's tape and the original plat map from when I'd purchased the house in 1998. The encroachment was even worse than I'd initially estimated. The pool structure extended 12.7 feet onto my property at its deepest point, with the decorative water feature and associated hardscaping covering nearly 1,200 square feet of my land. I photographed everything. GPS coordinates, measurements, angles showing the relationship to established property markers. I documented the removed oak tree, the destroyed rose garden, and the new drainage patterns that would undoubtedly direct chlorinated pool water onto my remaining landscaping. As a civil engineer, I knew that proper documentation would be crucial for any legal action. At 9:15 a.m. I called City Planning and requested copies of any permits filed for 2247 Oakwood Circle, Marcus's address. The clerk, Jennifer, knew me from my work with the county and expedited the request. By 11:30 a.m., I had my answer. No permits had been filed for pool construction, major, landscaping, or tree removal. Marcus had built his $70,000 amenity entirely without city approval, on property he didn't own. But I wasn't ready to call the city enforcement office yet. Marcus had made this personal when he destroyed Patricia's memorial garden. This wasn't just about property violations anymore. This was about a man who thought his money exempted him from basic human decency. And in my experience, people like Marcus always made bigger mistakes when they thought they were winning. I spent the next 2 days researching Marcus's property thoroughly. The county assessor's website showed that his home had been significantly modified since the original permits were issued. The square footage listed for tax purposes was 4,400 feet, but my engineer's eye estimated closer to 6,200. Either the assessor's records were wrong, or Marcus had been underreporting his property size to reduce his tax burden. I also discovered that the pool installation had been done by Premium Aquatic Designs, a company I recognized from several projects where they'd been cited for permit violations. Their Yelp reviews were filled with complaints about unpermitted work and customers being left to deal with city violations after the fact. On Thursday evening, Marcus appeared at my back door with 2 bottles of wine and his widest smile. "Nathan, buddy," he began, "I was thinking about our conversation the other day. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot about this pool situation." I invited him in, offered him coffee instead of the wine, and listened as he outlined his proposal. He'd pay to replace my rose garden with something more modern and throw in $5,000 for the inconvenience. All I had to do was sign a property line easement giving him permanent rights to the land his pool occupied. $5,000, he repeated, for 12 feet of dirt you weren't really using anyway. That's like winning the lottery for empty space. I nodded thoughtfully and told him I'd consider it. Marcus left convinced he'd solved our little disagreement with the application of money, as he'd undoubtedly solved countless other inconveniences throughout his privileged life. That night, I pulled out my laptop and began researching property law precedents, municipal code enforcement procedures, and civil remedies for trespass and property damage. Marcus had offered me $5,000 for land. That his pool improvement had probably added $40,000 to his property value. He thought I was a simple civil servant who didn't understand the financial dynamics at play. He was about to learn otherwise. Building the case. On Friday morning, I drove to the courthouse and filed a formal complaint for trespass, property damage, and requested injunctive relief requiring immediate restoration of my property line. The filing fee was $387. I also requested expedited review, given the ongoing daily trespass of the pool structure. My attorney, David Chen, reviewed the documentation that afternoon. David and I had worked together on several municipal projects over the years, and he understood both property law and construction regulations. "This is pretty clear-cut," he said, spreading the photos and survey documents across his conference table. "Intentional trespass, property damage, unpermitted construction. The tree removal alone carries significant penalties under the city's Heritage Oak Protection Ordinance. What kind of timeline are we looking at?" I asked. "Emergency injunction hearing could be scheduled within 2 weeks if you can demonstrate ongoing harm," David replied. "The unpermitted construction gives us grounds for immediate enforcement action." But I had a different timeline in mind. I'd done some research into Marcus's social media accounts and discovered that he'd been planning a major pool party for his 50th birthday, scheduled for the last Saturday of the month. The party was apparently the culmination of his pool project. His Facebook page showed him excitedly posting updates about caterers, a hired DJ, and a guest list that included several local business leaders and city council members. "David," I said, "what if we scheduled the injunction hearing for the Friday before his birthday party?" David smiled. "That would certainly maximize the impact of any court order. The precedent and The plan: I spent the weekend researching similar cases and found exactly what I needed. Morrison versus Castellanos, a 2018 case from our same county, where a homeowner had built a deck extending onto his neighbor's property. The court had ordered immediate demolition and awarded the property owner triple damages for the ongoing trespass. The key factor had been that the encroaching homeowner had been specifically warned about the property line violation and had proceeded anyway. Marcus's "sue me" comment, witnessed by two of his contractors who I'd managed to locate through Premium Aquatic Designs, would establish that he'd been informed of the violation and had proceeded with willful disregard. On Monday, I filed an amended complaint adding requests for treble damages under the precedent and punitive damages for willful trespass. I also sent formal notice to the City Code Enforcement Office regarding the unpermitted construction, tree removal, and property line violations. Tuesday brought a knock on my door from Code Enforcement Officer Lisa Rodriguez, someone I'd worked with on dozens of municipal projects. "Nathan," she said, "got your complaint about the property next door. Holy hell, what was he thinking?" I walked her through the violations, providing her with copies of my survey and photographic evidence. Lisa measured the encroachment independently and documented everything for her report. "This is going to be expensive for him," she said, making notes on her tablet. "Pool removal, restoration of the property line, replacement of the heritage oak, and penalties for unpermitted work. We're probably looking at $200,000 in compliance costs." "What's the enforcement timeline?" I asked. "Emergency notice gets posted today, hearing with the Code Enforcement Board next Wednesday. If they find violations, he gets 30 days to comply or face daily fines." Perfect timing. Marcus's party was still 2 weeks away. That evening, Marcus appeared at my door again, this time without wine and without his usual smile. "Nathan, what the hell is this?" He waved a copy of the code enforcement notice that had been posted on his front door. "You called the city on me?" "Marcus," I replied calmly, "you built a pool on my property without permission and told me to sue you when I asked about it. So I did exactly what you suggested." His face reddened. "This is ridiculous. I offered you money for that worthless strip of land. You're being petty and vindictive." "Petty," I repeated. "You destroyed my wife's memorial garden and cut down the tree where I scattered her ashes. You did this while I was out of town without discussing it with me, and then laughed about it when I objected. And I'm the one being petty?" Something in my tone must have gotten through to him because his arrogance faltered for just a moment. But then his usual entitlement reasserted itself. "Look," he said, "let's be practical about this. I've already spent $70,000 on this pool. You want more money? Fine. 10,000. 15. But I'm not tearing down a perfectly good pool because of some surveyor's map from the 1950s. "Marcus," I said, "you should probably talk to a lawyer and maybe find a different pool company for your next project." I closed the door and watched through the window as he stood on my porch for several minutes, apparently processing the reality that his money might not solve this particular problem. Near the hearing. The code enforcement hearing was scheduled for 2 p.m. on Wednesday at City Hall. I arrived early with David and a comprehensive presentation documenting every violation. Marcus showed up 10 minutes late with an expensive-looking attorney and an attitude that suggested he expected this to be a formality before returning to his normal life. The Code Enforcement Board consisted of 3 members: retired Judge Patricia Williams, civil, engineer Robert Santos, and landscape architect Maria Gonzalez. I knew all 3 professionally and had worked with Robert on several municipal infrastructure projects. Marcus's attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Bradley Pierce from one of the city's most expensive firms, went first. He argued that this was a civil property dispute that didn't belong before the Code Enforcement Board, that his client had acted in good faith based on an unclear property line, and that requiring demolition of a completed pool would constitute an excessive penalty. "My client is prepared to offer generous compensation to resolve this neighborly disagreement," Pierce concluded, and requests that the board recommend mediation rather than punitive enforcement action. David presented our case methodically, the survey evidence showing clear encroachment, the photographic documentation of destroyed landscaping and the illegally removed heritage oak, the permits that were never filed, and most importantly, the testimony from Premium Aquatics workers that Marcus had been specifically warned about the property line issue and had responded that the neighbor could sue him if they didn't like it. But the moment that changed everything came when board member Gonzalez asked Marcus directly, Mr. Hartwell, were you aware that you were building on your neighbor's property? Marcus, clearly coached by his expensive attorney, started to give a prepared response about unclear boundaries and good faith assumptions. But then Gonzalez followed up. And what was your response when Mr. Pierce brought this to your attention? I watched Marcus's face as he realized the trap. His attorney was frantically shaking his head, but Marcus's arrogance overrode his legal counsel. I told him if he didn't like it, he could sue me, Marcus said defiantly. It's 12 feet of worthless dirt. I improved the neighborhood. The board members exchanged glances. Judge Williams leaned forward. Mr. Hartwell, you're telling this board that you knowingly built on someone else's property and, when confronted about it, told them to take legal action rather than correcting the violation? It's not that simple, Marcus began, but his attorney grabbed his arm to stop him from talking. Too late. The board deliberated for exactly 7 minutes. Mr. Hartwell, Judge Williams announced, this board finds you in violation of Municipal Codes 17.3, 22.7, and 41.2 regarding unpermitted construction, heritage tree removal, and encroachment on adjacent property. You have 30 days to obtain proper permits, remove all structures from the neighboring property, and restore the property line to its original condition. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $1,000 and potential criminal charges for continuing trespass. Marcus's attorney requested an appeal hearing, which was granted for the following week, but that would be too late to stop what was coming next. The injunction. Friday morning at 9 a.m., David and I appeared before Judge Harrison in Superior Court for the emergency injunction hearing. Marcus's attorney had filed for a continuance, arguing that his client needed more time to prepare a defense, but Judge Harrison denied the motion. Mr. Pierce, the judge said to Marcus's attorney, your client has been knowingly trespassing on someone else's property for 3 weeks. The plaintiff is entitled to immediate relief. David presented our case efficiently. Clear property line violation, documented damages, and Marcus's admission that he'd been warned about the encroachment and had proceeded anyway. Marcus's attorney argued for a reasonable timeline to remedy the situation, suggesting that immediate demolition was excessive and that the matter could be resolved through financial compensation. Judge Harrison reviewed the documentation, including the transcript from the code enforcement hearing where Marcus had admitted to knowingly building on my property. The defendant's position, Judge Harrison said, appears to be that he can take someone else's land and then negotiate the price after the fact. This court strongly disagrees with that approach to property rights. The injunction was granted. Marcus had 72 hours to begin demolition of all structures on my property and 7 days to complete restoration of the property line. The court also awarded temporary damages of $500 per day for every day the trespass continued. As we left the courthouse, David handed me a copy of the order. Demolition has to start by Monday morning, he said. If it doesn't, we can request that the sheriff enforce the order. Marcus's birthday party was scheduled for Saturday. The birthday surprise. Saturday morning, I was awakened at 5:47 a.m. by the sound of diesel engines. Looking out my bedroom window, I saw 2 demolition trucks parked in Marcus's driveway, along with a crane and several workers in safety vests. Marcus appeared on his back deck in his pajamas, frantically waving his arms and shouting at the crew foreman. I could hear fragments of the conversation through my open window. Supposed to be my birthday party tonight. Court order says demolition starts today, sir. $70,000. I made coffee and sat on my back porch to watch. The demolition crew was professional and efficient. They'd laid protective sheeting over Marcus's remaining landscaping and positioned the crane to lift the pool equipment without damaging his house. By 8 a.m., they had drained the pool and were cutting through the concrete with hydraulic saws. Marcus appeared at my back door at 8:30, still in his pajamas, his usual arrogance replaced by something approaching panic. Nathan, you've got to stop this, he pleaded. I'll pay for everything. 20,000, 30, whatever you want. But I've got 60. People coming tonight for my birthday. The caterers, the DJ, everything's been planned for months. I sipped my coffee and looked at him calmly. Marcus, you had 30 days to fix this voluntarily. You chose to fight it in court instead. The judge gave you 72 hours. This is you complying with a court order. This is vindictive, he shouted. You're destroying $70,000 of improvement over 12 feet of dirt. No, I replied. You destroyed your $70,000 improvement when you built it on someone else's property. You also destroyed my wife's memorial garden and cut down a protected heritage oak. But somehow this is all my fault for not letting you steal my land. I stood up to go back inside, then paused. Oh, and Marcus? Happy birthday. By noon, the pool was gone. The concrete had been broken up and hauled away, the tile and fixtures removed, the plumbing capped. Where Marcus's paradise had been that morning, there was now a muddy crater exactly 12.7 feet onto my property, along with a significant portion of his own backyard that had been torn up to access the pool structure. The demolition crew worked until 4 p.m., filling in the excavation and roughly grading the area. Marcus's yard looked like a construction site, complete with tire ruts, scattered debris, and a layer of concrete dust over everything. At 6 p.m., guests began arriving for Marcus's birthday party. From my kitchen window, I watched as luxury cars pulled up to find Marcus's dream entertaining space replaced by a disaster area. The infinity pool where his guests were supposed to be lounging was now a patch of freshly disturbed dirt. The elegant hardscaping had been replaced by construction fencing and caution tape. Marcus stood on his back deck, still in work clothes covered in concrete dust, trying to explain to increasingly confused party guests what had happened to his pool. I couldn't hear the conversations, but the body language told the story. Hands gesturing at the destruction, guests looking shocked, several people leaving after brief conversations. By 8 p.m., the party was down to a handful of die-hard friends drinking beer on Marcus's deck and staring at the moonlit wasteland where his backyard used to be. The aftermath. Monday morning brought Marcus to my door one final time. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his usual designer outfit replaced by wrinkled khakis and a stained polo shirt. Nathan, he said quietly, I want to apologize. I was wrong about the property line, wrong about the way I handled it, and wrong about what that garden meant to you. I'm sorry. It was the first genuine thing I'd ever heard him say. I nodded and waited for him to continue. The tree replacement is going to cost me $12,000 for a comparable heritage oak, he said. The city wants it planted within 60 days. The rose garden restoration, my landscaper estimates another $8,000 to match what you had before. And the pool demolition and yard restoration came to $34,000. I did the math in my head. Marcus's sue me attitude had cost him approximately $124,000, not counting his attorney fees, court costs, and the code enforcement fines. There's something else, he continued. The city inspector found problems with my house construction during the code enforcement investigation. Apparently, some of the additions weren't properly permitted. They want me to bring everything up to code or face daily fines. I knew from my own inspection what they'd found. Marcus's house was probably 1,800 square feet larger than what he'd been paying taxes on, representing years of tax avoidance. The penalties alone would be substantial. Nathan, he said, I know I don't have any right to ask this, but would you be willing to write a letter to the Code Enforcement Board? Maybe explain that the property line issue has been resolved and that I'm trying to make things right? I considered the request. Marcus had learned an expensive lesson, but more importantly, he seemed to finally understand that his actions had consequences that money couldn't always fix. Marcus, I said, I'll write the letter. But I want you to understand something. This was never about 12 feet of land. This was about respect. Respect for property lines, respect for your neighbors, and respect for things that can't be replaced with money. He nodded, looking genuinely humbled for the first time since I'd known him. I'll get the tree planted first, he said. Same variety as the one I cut down. And Nathan, thank you for teaching me something I should have learned a long time ago. Resolution. 6 months later, Marcus's yard had been fully restored. The heritage oak he'd planted was thriving, positioned exactly where the original tree had stood. Patricia's memorial rose garden had been replanted with identical varieties, and Marcus had even added a small bronze plaque acknowledging the garden's significance. The relationship between us had evolved into something resembling actual neighborliness. Marcus still lived extravagantly, but he'd started asking about permits before starting projects and had introduced himself to other neighbors instead of treating the cul-de-sac like his personal estate. The city code enforcement investigation had ultimately cost Marcus an additional $87,000 in permits, improvements, and back taxes, bringing his total lesson to well over $200,000. But perhaps more importantly, It had cost him the arrogant assumption that rules didn't apply to people with enough money to ignore them. I kept working my engineering job, maintaining Patricia's garden, and living quietly in the house we'd shared for 23 years. The oak tree grew taller each season, its branches eventually extending over both properties as the original had done, creating shade for both yards without regard for artificial boundaries. Marcus never built another pool, but he did install a small fountain near the restored property line with an inscription that read, "Good fences make good neighbors. Robert Frost." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, and sometimes that's enough. The last time we spoke about the pool incident was during a neighborhood barbecue the following summer. Marcus was grilling hamburgers for the annual block party, an event he'd never participated in before his expensive education in property law. "You know," he said, flipping burgers while his guests mingled in his properly restored yard, "I used to think being a good neighbor meant having the best house on the block. Turns out it's more about respecting the people who live next to you." I raised my beer in a small toast. "Marcus, that might be the most expensive lesson anyone's ever learned about property lines." He laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd ever heard from him. "Worth every penny," he said. "Though next time I want to improve my backyard, I'm definitely checking the survey first." Sometimes the best revenge isn't about making someone pay, it's about making them learn. Marcus learned that money can't buy respect, that actions have consequences, and that some things, once destroyed, require more than cash to rebuild. But most importantly, he learned that being a good neighbor isn't about having the biggest house or the most expensive amenities. It's about understanding that we all share the same small piece of the world, and we're all responsible for treating it, and each other, with respect. The pool is gone, but the lesson remains, built into the foundation of how Marcus now approaches every interaction with the people around him. And sometimes that's the most satisfying revenge of all, watching someone become a better person because they finally faced real consequences for their actions. In my 23 years as a civil engineer, I've learned that every structure needs a solid foundation to last. The same is true for relationships. Marcus built his pool on someone else's land and wondered why it couldn't stand. Sometimes the most important construction project isn't building something new. It's rebuilding trust, respect, and understanding on the proper foundation of mutual consideration. Patricia would have loved seeing her roses bloom, again in the shadow of that new oak tree. Some things, once properly planted, grow stronger than ever.